While generative AI, certainly in its current form and for the foreseeable future, isn't going to put professional software developers out of business, it is creating a whole set of new skills that professional developers are going to need to learn.
Can these tools be used for much higher order cognitive tasks than just generate 500 insert statements for me, generate 1,000 objects of JSON that I can just plug into my code, right? Which are really just low-level grunt work. Is it capable of helping with higher order tasks? And I have learned a lot of things about that as well.
You are listening to Stories from the Hackery, a podcast about the students, alumni, and community members that continue to shape Nashville Software School. NSS is the nation's first nonprofit coding bootcamp, where anyone with aptitude and motivation can gain the skills needed for a career in tech. For more information, visit NashvilleSoftwareSchool.com.
Morning, everybody. Good day, good evening, whatever time it is. I'm John Wark. I'm the founder and CEO of Nashville Software School, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
Yeah, Steve Brownlee. So I've been a developer for, let's just say, many years. And when John started the software school back in 2012, I was very interested in it. And a few years after it was started, I actually joined him full time, and I've been leading the web development program in the daytime ever since.
I guess I want to start maybe with the punchline, which is that here at Nashville Software School, we've been keeping a very interested eye on generative AI for the last year and a half, really probably ever since ChatGPT went public in 2022. Trying to figure out what it means for our students, right? What's it going to do to the job market? Because, we've all heard all the BS around, generative AI is going to put all of us out of work in general, or it's going to put programmers out of work, coders out of work. And, that didn't feel right to us originally, right? But we'll talk a little bit about our timeline of discovery and research here in a few minutes. But we've come to the conclusion that, while generative AI, certainly in its current form and for the foreseeable future, isn't going to put professional software developers out of business, it is creating a whole set of new skills that professional developers are going to need to learn, because it's going to become an integral part of the skill set that all developers need. And so we're going to be starting, to teach, one of those core skills, which Steve will be talking about here in a little while, called prompt engineering, to our students. Once they've learned how to write code for themselves, we'll teach them how to get an AI tool to generate decent code with them, or for them, I think maybe more appropriately. So that's kind of the punchline. We're going to talk about some research that Steve's been doing, some examples of some project work that he's done that's resulted what I found to be really interesting results, and he's written all that up, and we'll have a link in the show notes to the longer blog post on that fact. So, Steve, anything you want to add to that before we sort of dig in a little deeper?
I think, yeah, that was a great summary. The only thing I'd add is that, when I start talking about many of the strategies that we've learned that have been effective specifically at NSS, I've actually learned a lot from the students on top of my own experimentation, because they've been trying with certain successes and certain failures, and we've been trying to incorporate that into how we coach them as well.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good point. We haven't been teaching prompt engineering to our students yet. And in fact, have actively discouraged them from using these tools to generate code for class exercises and whatever, because, we believe that students have to learn how to do this stuff for themselves. At least that was our belief, going back over the last year, and I don't think you're going to suggest anything different when we get to that point. But we have been working with our students to learn to use LLMs in a more general supportive way, right? As a way to give them advice to help them learn, really
Right.
as a learning tool, right? So because that's another powerful use of generative AI tools, LLMs like ChatGPT or Claude. We've also not only learned from our students, we've learned also from our grads, right? So one of the things that we did, going on 9 months ago or so now, I think, we said, well, let's find out what our grads are doing. We've got hundreds of grads who are working as software developers. It was at that point, 6, 8, 9 months after the announcement of ChatGPT. We said one of the things we can do to try to put some substance behind the hype, or some grounding behind the hype, is, well, let's survey our grads and see what they're doing on the job, right? So you help, you put together survey, along with a few other folks at NSS. We sent it out, and we learned a number of things from that told us that, at least at that time, our grads were very clear: don't integrate this in the class, because you can't trust it. Students have to learn how to write code on their own, so that they can manage the generative code. So but they also said very large numbers, oh yeah, we're using this, mostly without official sanction from our employer.
Right.
So people were using it on their own personal projects. Their employer had said, well, yeah, okay, you can use one of these tools, but be very careful and don't put the code into production. Or it was clear that that employers were still very much struggling with, what do these things mean, and should we adopt them, or had recognized some of the risks. I don't know, what were some of the other takeaways that you thought were key takeaways from that research we did with our students?
Yeah, that was the primary kind of overview of, at that point, how people were using it. But I also heard anecdotally from people reaching out to me through a variety of channels that they, kind of at a deeper level than that survey, they were saying that they have learned to refine their use of the tool to be almost like an intern for themselves.
Yeah.
Like you said, they learned not to trust all of the code. Sometimes it was accurate, several times it was not. So making it do, I think, busy work was like the number one thing that people really said to me one-on-one.
Yes.
It does the busy work for me, so I don't have to write 1,000 lines of JSON or some sort of repetitive task. I've learned that that's a big use of the tool from our grads, and also explaining as they're working in these larger systems, especially when they're fresh out of the school, they're in a larger system, facing patterns they've never seen before. They're using it to help them understand what those patterns are.
Yeah, you use the word intern there. That's one of the best descriptions that I've heard of how to think about one of these generative AI tools. And that's true for generating code or anything else. It's a very smart, very eager intern,
Right.
which means you have to give it very detailed instructions, and you have to supervise and review its work very carefully, which sort of feels to me like a good summary of how you can use these things.
Yeah.
So, we went in very concerned, I think, about the whole hype cycle, right? Because, generative AI's adoption has been widely discussed. It's been the fastest adoption by consumers of technology, of any technology ever, right? It got to, was it ChatGPT? It got to 100 million users faster than anything ever has. And, lots of other, data of that sort, as people have, rushed to sort of explore this stuff. Um, but lots of hype to go with that. Lots of people with their own self-interest claiming that it was going to put developers out of work because they were either investors in or principals of companies building AI tools to generate code, things like that. But so we started again, starting to integrate this into classes with our students as a teaching tool, much like we've always taught students to do searches, right? And to develop good skills for searching using sites like Stack Overflow or just, whatever, learning how to, be very explicit in how you search to get detailed answers. It seems like we kind of started a lot of our activity, getting students used to using, say, a ChatGPT. I guess we'll use ChatGPT as sort of a generic label for generative AI here, probably. Getting them used to the idea of these tools and whatever. But, I think you quickly, came to the conclusion that, that these things weren't going to put software developers out of work, but might make them much more productive, which I think is what the industry research has said, right? I mean, that's been my takeaway for things we've seen from like GitHub's, stats that they've published from the early tests of their generative AI coding tool. It's called GitHub Copilot. That it's a productivity booster because it, what was the term you used? Grunt work.
Yes.
That it sort of scrapes a lot of that low level coding off of the experienced developer's plate and takes it on, right? Which sort of feels to me like what we've been doing for as long as I've been in this field, which is 50 years. I had to write assembler code for some stuff when I first started. Most of us haven't written any assembler code for a long, long time, right?
A couple of years, yeah.
Yeah, a day or two. We've been working on higher level tools that took care of generating or translating to those lower levels, and that's been going on, right, for forever.
Yep.
So, in some respects, to me, this sort of feels like some of that same progression, albeit with dramatically different kind of tool based on a very different technology. Right. So, I don't know how that feels to you, but anyways, so I don't know we've touched on what our timeline at NSS have been. It was watching, initially first half of 2023, seeing what's going on, talking to people, then surveying grads. Then we established a sort of a temporary policy that, we weren't going to teach grads to generate code because since our students are starting from scratch, we needed them to learn how to still write code just as much as we ever did, was our feeling. But I would say we stepped up our active exploration of how to start using these tools to support learning in our boot camps. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. How have the students come to learn to use generative AI, or how have you and the other instructors come to learn to coach the students in using the tools as a learning assistant more than a coding assistant?
It's funny, one of my first observations with the use of these tools was via the students, because it's exciting, it's brand new, and they thought it could help them understand things. So the students back in those days, let's say early 2023, they were the ones who were coming to me and saying, man, this tool really sucks, right? I asked it to try to help me with this exercise. I asked it to maybe help figure out why this function wasn't working. But because the tool didn't have the context that was needed, it would just produce garbage. Right. And they actually lost a lot of faith in it as a actual coding assistant. And what they were telling me, around that time, there were 2 cohorts that I was kind of running. They found it useful for very small, discrete chunks of code where they couldn't articulate like the syntax and the vocabulary for it. It was outstanding at helping them understand very finite, discrete chunks of code. And in the next cohort, somebody discovered that it was also really good at being almost like a math tutor. They would they prompted it to say, I'm a beginner JavaScript, C# developer, whatever. Every day, I'd like you to throw some basic exercises at me for me to practice my skills on functions and modules and data types and things like that. And they reported back that actually did a really good job, as long as they told it very clearly that I am a beginner, right? I'm in a boot camp. I don't know much. That they found it helpful to augment their learning and that it was horrible at helping them write code way before even I discovered it, because they were just trying it more than I was, because they're beginners.
Well, that's interesting, because it's almost like setting it up to be almost like a flashcard system.
Right. A lot of students are using that now, because once I got that feedback, that spread throughout that cohort pretty quickly. And then I've taken that, and I basically in the first week of a cohort, I tell them about that, and a lot of people adopt it. Now, that doesn't mean that some students get a little overzealous and still will try to have it generate code and then take that code and put it into theirs. Just as a side note, it's funny that being a beginner is hard, right? And they think they not sneak things past us, but they will present code and say, well, here's the solution that I came up with, or if they're in a collaborative project, here's what we came up with. Of course, they have no knowledge that me or any instructor can look at that code and instantaneously know whether they wrote it or if they had some assistance through a generative AI tool. So it's been interesting to try to find the right balance. And I told them they got to find the needle and find it right in the middle. Whereas, okay, it's cool that you use this resource, right? Because software developers use all resources at their disposal at all times. Yep. So it's cool that you're using this, but on the job, right? Because we try to make everything about the job. On the job, if you took this code and you plugged it in and you pushed that to production, right? Some other, perhaps a junior developer or somebody who just didn't do a code review said, yeah, it looks good to me. And it went into production. And you really have no idea what that code is doing. You just thought it solved the problem. You could get into real trouble, right? Potentially even losing your job. So we try to give them that guidance that, yes, use all the resources, but you also must clearly understand the code. So that's one thing that they learned fairly early in the course with our coaching and guidance. And how we use it as instructors, again, we use it as an intern. Every time that we use it is if we're going to be doing some sort of like workshop with the students that involves a lot of data. Well, we will just go to the tool, and I'm not writing 1,000 rows in this database, and we'll go write all of the SQL, insert 50 rows here and 20 rows here, and we use it to accelerate our timeline when we're preparing to do something with the students. And I would say the only time that we've utilized it to generate code ourselves is last year. There were some, I think, lunch and learns that we were all going to do. And one of the instructors and I, Josh Barton, we used to generate small modules of code one at a time when we had already gone through the process, like, all right, here's what we want to build, here's the components. And we would have it do the busy work of, writing the initial code for us, which we tweak as it always does. It's about 80% right every time. So that's about the extent of how we use it in terms of integrating into our ability to work with the students and do workshops so that we can get to that as quickly as possible. It really is that intern. I'm trying to find ways, and we'll get into this. Is kind of the point of that article I wrote, which we'll get into. But I always started to experiment after a coffee that you and I had, and I'd been thinking about this for a while because of the way the students were using it. Is, can these tools be used for much higher order cognitive tasks than just generate this, 500 insert statements for me, generate 1,000 objects of JSON that I can just plug into my code, right? Which are really just low level grunt work. Is it capable of helping with higher order tasks? And I have learned a lot of things about that as well.
Yeah, the results of that experiment I thought were really interesting. Now, just for a second before we get to that, there are a couple of other things that we have done, right? So you and Michael Holloway, who's is your peer for our data programs, right? So Steve is our lead instructor for the full-time web development program. And Michael Holloway is our lead instructor for our data programs, data analytics and data science. You and Michael collaborated on creating a prompt engineering class.
Right.
And you've had the experience now of delivering that twice, I believe, to some of our graduates who are sort of in their job search for the first job. I'm curious how the experience of building and delivering that prompt engineering class, has that, or was that an important, a piece of sort of your learning journey to get us to the point where we're now, going to integrate this more directly in classes as a generative
Yes, that refined and I would say deepened my context for how these tools can be utilized. As Michael was learning all of the basic tools and he was doing his own exploration. We were reading a bunch of articles. One of the things that came out of our investigation is how to, again, it all comes down to the design of your prompt and being as specific as possible. We discovered that a lot of people were using it for, what's the best way to describe it? For example, so in the workshop, here's one of the examples I give the students. Imagine you're a new product designer, fresh out of school, and you're working for Johnson and Johnson or Kraft Foods or something like that, and you want to wow your supervisor. You want to come up with a brand new product. You can actually use this tool to accelerate your timeline for the whole process of product design, development, and deployment. That things that you may not have learned in school, because the tool is such a great summarizer of information. And for me, that's one of the biggest distinctions between generative AI and Google searches. Because Google searches just, these articles match your keywords.
Yeah,
and then
right.
You got to go read it all, which could take weeks, maybe even months, depending on what your task is. But the generative AI will summarize all 1,000 articles into something that is readable. So that's one thing that I learned through that process, and that was really eye-opening for the people who came to the workshop. Is with not really sophisticated prompts, but you just got to be careful on how you phrase it. That as a new product designer, it really did. It helped you understand how to do market research. It helped you understand how to do market research and supply chain sourcing and legal and regulatory ramifications, how to set up production, right? It was an amazing. Once I started, and Michael and I started to play around with it, and I saw what it was capable of doing, like, this could save weeks, months, possibly even years of time by doing that high level summarization. For me, that was the biggest takeaway of what we were trying in that course. And what the couple times I ran it, that was definitely the biggest value add, that the people who came to it said, "Oh, I didn't realize it could do that for me."
Yeah, I think that's one of the really great use cases for generative AI from what we've seen, is that sort of summarization. Let me boil down the fire hose of information for you. Yeah. And you can see that from, take a whole field of knowledge and give me some places to start and boil it down to things like, Zoom's AI assistant, which is a great summarizer of what, possibly an hour, 2 hour long Zoom call. Right. So, people that haven't gotten into generative AI yet, not just developers, but I mean, people in really any environment, that summarization use case is a really powerful one for generative AI.
Right.
So, all right. Well, so you alluded to, that coffee we had, and the work you had already started doing before we talked about, trying to see if the generative AI tools could do a little bit of deeper work for you. And this is, the project that you ended up summarizing in your blog post that we'll have a link to in the show notes. So, so talk us through a little bit, sort of where you started, because you started in a different spot than where you sort of ended up
Right.
with that project.
Yeah. So the beginning of this little waterfall of exploration that I had done started with cohort 66 when they were going through their server-side course. I was working with them about creating some database diagrams for some projects they were working on. And just for funsies, I said, hey, gang, I wonder if we could take this markdown that describes our database diagram. Could we give that to ChatGPT and have it generate SQL for us? I had no idea if I could do it or not. It was just an experiment. And so I took this, probably only had 4 or 5 tables in it, and I pasted it into ChatGPT. I said, here's the markdown for my database. Can you generate all of the create table statements, the insert statements, and can you generate some select statements that will give me the specific information? So it wasn't really just about setting up the database. I was like, is it intelligent enough from the markdown of my database to actually generate accurate SQL that could possibly join multiple tables and complex feature requirements? And it did. And that was my first moment of, wow, okay, this isn't just a JSON producer for me, right? It's not just a
Right.
statement producer for me. It's actually pretty good at slightly more complex tasks, as long as I give it the context, right? That was the key thing, is I gave it the markdown for the structure of my database. Instead of just saying, I've got a database with these 3 tables, can you build SQL for me? I had to give it very specific technical context.
So you had to essentially give it a detailed requirement statement. I mean, that, to me, that's how I've been thinking about, for developers anyways. That's how I've been thinking about the prompts that we have to give these tools, or the context we set. It's really giving the tool the requirements that we'd have to give a human developer in a lot of respects, right? To have them write the right code. The difference being that while we've been taught for at least the 50 years I've been in this field that you're supposed to do detailed requirements, we all know we don't most of the time, because humans can fill in the blanks, right? Particularly a more experienced developer. So anyways, so just for people listening to this, do you remember what version of ChatGPT was able to do this? Was it 3.5? Was it 4?
At the time, it was 3.5. 4 hadn't come out yet when they started.
Okay, so 3.
I will say I've tried it with 4, and 4 is significantly better at it.
Okay, but 3.5 was good enough.
Yes.
That at least generating the SQL statements from from your database schema worked.
Right.
Yep. Okay. When you say 4 is better, is the quality? Do you mean the quality of the SQL is better, or it can handle more complex scenarios? How do you mean better in that?
It's the
context,
complexity.
Steve? Okay.
It was able to handle more complex. So getting into the next phase, and I'll kind of describe where I got to. How I realized
great.
it was better. So the next thing I tried when I got the next cohort, right, they were going through their initial, real beginners, and we teach them how to visualize algorithmic thinking with these things called sequence diagrams, which a lot of development teams use. So I was coaching a student through their, I was reviewing basically their sequence diagram, and I just had this weird connection. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. With my last cohort, I took the markdown for this thing and it was able to give me some output for it. Can I take something even more abstract, like a sequence diagram, have it ingest that, and say, here's how my system currently works. My product owner just came to me with a new feature. Can you help me design what that new feature would look like in JavaScript. And what it gave me back, again, I was shocked. I was expecting garbage, and I got a real solution back from it, right? It was beginner level because I told it I'm a beginner JavaScript, right? So it actually did a good job of producing beginner level code, which module it should be in, what imports and exports were needed. It put comments in the code with full explanations about everything that it was doing. And it was a fairly adequate solution for the feature that I told it to write for me. And so that even launched it off even further. So I then took, and this is about when 4 came around, but I was still using 3.5 for this. That's when I decided to really dig into this. And I think that probably 2 or 3 weeks after this, when you and I had our coffee. And so I decided to try 4, and I took larger sequence diagrams, larger database schemas, gave it to 3.5, and I don't know what the threshold was, but I exceeded the threshold of 3.5, and it really started to fall down and produce a lot of inaccurate data. But then when I tried it with
by exceeded the threshold, you mean you probably fed it more than the context window,
right?
In 3.5 could okay, gotcha.
Right. But 4 was easily able to handle, and then I was getting again back highly accurate SQL statements that were near perfect. Like I was used to getting approximately 80% accurate responses from it when I was asking it technical questions. When I was doing this, because I was providing it with all of the context that it needed, most of the times the output I was getting was completely accurate. It wasn't even 80 or even 95. Many times it was 100% accurate. So yeah, so that was kind of the progress to get to what I really tried with that article, in a very large system with very complex requirements, very complex system, right? And because that is where I'm thinking about now. Can these things handle system level tasks?
And this is was an existing system, right?
Right.
To which you wanted to do some additional work. So, it's basically more like a refactoring exercise, which, let's face it, most of us as developers, we spend more time refactoring old code than we do getting to write new code. So,
right.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, kind of what that exercise was and what you learned.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of what any experienced developer does on the job is they build up little chunks of the code base over time to, this feature, that feature, that feature. And you look at the code 6 months later and realize this is not very efficient because I wasn't thinking about its effect on everything. So I had a, database is about 40 tables long, React client, Django server, all run on Postgres database. So not the biggest system in the world, but larger than I thought something like these generative AI tools would be able to help me out with. So that was my challenge that I was going to give it. And I had built up, in the API side, all these little features as we were building out the product. And it eventually got to the point where one of the request response cycles was just taking far too long. So I decided, okay, I think this is a great opportunity to try this tool, because it was, in essence, what was happening is there was information in about, I think, 10 or 11 different tables in the database that all of these individual statements I had written were trying to pull together into one cohesive piece of data that would be sent back to the browser. And which is a fairly complex task, even for a human being, to try to figure out how to take all of these different factors, pull them again into one. Right. So organizationally, it's a challenge cognitively, and then make it more efficient, which is also very challenging cognitively. So this was the big challenge, and this is what the article is all about. So I took the markdown for my database, and I had it in just that. I said, here's the entire database scheme, all 40 tables. Now I'm also giving you additional context. Here is my Django model that has about 8 of these features in it. Not all of them, but it had 8 of the features. It said each one of these pieces of this module of code are doing, discrete queries, right? And by doing them separately, It is really making this process last longer than I'm comfortable with. Can you take all of these operations and combine them down to one? And I didn't give it any guidance specifically on how to do that. I said, can you just combine them into one operation? So the first thing I came out of this was with ChatGPT 4. It said, yes, you can combine these into a single Django ORM statement, or you can combine them and go lower level and do it at the database level with raw SQL. And that's the route that it decided to go down. Even though it had mentioned I could do it at the higher level, it started to actually produce the SQL code at the lower level. I guess it just determined statistically that that was probably the better way to go. And, it was a fairly large SQL statement that produced, which that was the first thing that surprised me, is that just the complexity of the SQL statement that it was able to produce, given the context that I had given it. So I all right, mind blown a little bit. So I take that query and I run it, just move it over my code and I run it. And it got most of it right. It really did. Like right out of the box, it got most of it right. It had a couple tables that were misspelled because it made a couple assumptions, as it always does. And a couple of the joins were inners instead of lefts, right? I had to make some small tweaks to it, which took me about 10 minutes. I'm like, okay, yeah, this is it. This gets all 8 of those operations into one SQL call. So now my mind's really blown. And so I just iterated on that, right? So, well, there was a couple other features in different places in the code base that weren't part of this. So I'm like, okay, well, add this in there. All right, here you go. All right, add this in there. All right, here you go. And, probably through maybe 8, 9, 10 iterations, I had something that was working and it was vastly more efficient. It actually, produced all of the code that I would need in my Python. Like, here's the code you need to integrate this database function into your code. Here's how you connection and get it and pull back the results. And I said, oh, by the way, can you show me how to write a serializer to convert this data to JSON? And they're like, yeah, here you go. And spot on, perfect. Then, all right, well, I've also heard some cool things about this Claude tool. Well, I go over and honestly just copy and paste the exact same prompts that I used for ChatGPT. I did not modify them one letter. Fed it to Claude, and the first thing it spat out at me, rather than going the SQL route, it went the Django ORM route, and again produced this very long block of code that, in essence, was the mirror image of the SQL code that ChatGPT had created for me, just in that higher level language. And so I tried that out. It was less accurate only because it's an ORM, right? So it was doing its best, but there's only so far you can get with an ORM. But not only did it produce the ORM code, but it also generated SQL code, but with a completely different strategy than ChatGPT had done. ChatGPT had chosen to use what are called CTEs, common table expressions. Mm-hmm. Claude went completely like, nope, just join them all. Just left join, left join, left join, left join, left join, left join, with maybe some subqueries thrown in there that were needed. I think there were probably 2 or 3 subqueries thrown in there. But that, again, was very startling that these 2 different tools that were both generating high quality output for me had completely different strategies for it.
Yeah, that was one of the things that blew me away when you got to that point with this project, is it just as if you had given this project to 2 different developers, right? You've got 2 different approaches, right? So if I'd given it to 2 different developers that had slightly different experience or different training, they'd give you 2 different answers, right? You wouldn't get identical code from them, right? And so
and it didn't take a week, right? Because if I had delegated this to members of my team, said, all right, you go try this, it would have taken them 3, 4, 5, 6 days, bare minimum. And now I'm presented with 2 things that I need to make a judgment call on. Well, with these tools, I had it all in 30 minutes, even with tweaking. And for what rang true for me is I recently read a book called Power and Prediction that
Right.
some specialists in AI were talking about how these tools, they are statistical models, right? So they're going to present you with possibilities, and then your role as a human still is to judge those
Right.
possibilities based off of their accuracy. And
Yeah.
that really drove that point home to me is two different tools. This one produced two possible solutions. This one produced another type of solution, but all three were different. I still, as the human, had to make the judgment call on which one of those strategies that I had to move forward with.
Yeah, as you say, these things, these generative AI tools are probabilistic, right? I mean, they really are predicting the next token, which the next word, the next symbol
Yep.
in your code, what have you. And so they're very susceptible to, well, how were they trained? Just like a human developer would be, right? What training day? And certainly, while there may have been significant overlap in the training corpus, right? Because it may have been open source projects from GitHub or, whatever, probably got fed different ways, probably got different fine tuning. So they favored somewhat different strategies, right? So, which isn't that different than what a junior developer would do for you as a senior developer if you asked them to do it, right?
Right.
So,
I've been wondering recently if one of the next big evolutions in this field is somebody writing a tool that defers problems and prompts to multiple of these engines, right? And sits on top of, let's say, 5 other engines. And we'll summarize the response from 5 different generative AI tools and present in a usable interface. Like, here are your predictions. You decide which one you want to go with.
Yeah. Yeah. Or yeah, where that higher level tool may have some more specific like code optimization knowledge and
Right.
be able to tell you based on the size of your database and the configuration of your database that the ORM strategy is going to be a lot slower than the SQL strategy in this solution, or this SQL solution is better than that one.
Right.
So, oh yeah, we're in such early days, right, of the evolution of these and in figuring out how to integrate that LLM into other tool sets.
Right.
I suspect there's a lot of interesting stuff coming, but yeah, so if I'm understanding, kind of what you said, your work was in figuring out how to prompt it, right?
Right.
So gathering the specs, setting the context right, doing the prompts, and then evaluating the results.
Right.
And you sent your intern off to generate code, and they brought you some alternatives back. Which is, again, it's kind of fascinating. Now, my understanding is, and I haven't seen this yet, is that you took this exercise further and tried a third tool. Is that right?
I decided to use GitHub Copilot just to see what the results might be, right? Because using Claude and getting a completely different response kind of inspired me and got me curious. What other responses can I get? But knowing that GitHub Copilot, again, was engineered and trained for a very specific task, which is auto completion as the developer is writing code.
Right.
I hadn't seen much about anybody really trying it for these higher level system tasks. That doesn't mean people weren't, but so I was curious.
Yeah. Again, so just for context, maybe for listeners, Claude and ChatGPT are similar in that they're what's called a foundation model. They're trained on massive amounts of data, but general purpose data of all sorts. Code is just one of the things. Coding was effectively, I think, what they call an emergent behavior, right? They didn't train it to code, but it learned how to code by absorbing all of this massive amounts of data, which included a lot of code. Whereas GitHub Copilot, while it's based on a foundation model, which is an older version of ChatGPT, I believe, it's had extensive additional training, additional fine tuning, specifically for the programming task, right? So Sorry, I just wanted to
Yes.
explicate that a little bit. So jump back in, Steve.
Yeah.
Shut me up.
So I finally installed Copilot extension. Well, I won't get into the nitty-gritty details. So once I figured out what it was actually doing and how to use it, I took a more condensed version of what I had given to the other tools, because GitHub, the Copilot, it's an extension in Visual Studio Code, which is the code editor. And what it does is, by gaining access, because it basically has access to your entire code base, because all of that is loaded into your code editor, which enables its auto completion. So I decided to take a more concise version of my prompt, because this tool, in theory, has access to my entire project already,
Right.
including all of my database models and the fields on them and the relationships between them. So I felt I didn't need to give it that context, because it already had that context. It was sitting right there. And put it in, so I started in that same module of code that had all of those discrete queries in it, and click the little star that kicks off the process. And I said, this is what I need you to do. I was very specific. I said, these are the models involved. These are the fields that I want in the response. This is how I want, this thing summarized or this thing grouped. Like, again, I was very, very specific, only because I wasn't giving it as much internal context at the beginning, assuming it would glean that through its own crawling of my code. And so it produced some SQL for me that the first time I tried it just was not accurate. It just wasn't. Which was, again, surprising and disappointing, because I had a false assumption that having access to my entire code base, it would be intelligent enough to put all the statistical analysis together and understand how all of the models of my database worked, and it just didn't. So I put it a little bit more specific prompt in there, which increased the accuracy of the SQL by a tiny bit. But again, it was nowhere near the complexity and the accuracy that Claude and ChatGPT had produced. And that's kind of where I ended my investigation, because in my mind, the cost benefit ratio just wasn't worth it, because at that point I had the feeling I'd have to spend 3 days trying to figure out the right way to prompt this thing to produce even close to the same level of code that these other things. And I wasn't willing to put in that much time, when I know I could just use these other tools.
Well, right. You already had working code, so you didn't need to do that. So is your suspicion that it takes a different prompting strategy with GitHub Copilot, given that it's a narrower, generative AI tool?
Yeah.
And it's integrated in the editor, so you've got a very different style of interface, right?
Right. I think if I was going to try this again, I would have to validate my assumptions and perhaps provide because I know there's some features I haven't used of it yet. So is there a way for me to provide that database schema markdown to it? Because it clearly couldn't figure it out itself, even though it had access to all of my files. It just, apparently that wasn't engineered for that. So I think I would have to largely follow the stream strategy that I use with the other tools, which is, here's the entire raw database schema, right? No questions. You don't have to try to figure it out through Django models. This is it, and see if it can be more accurate with that.
Right. So it wasn't able to start with the Django model and then find the database schema. Right. So, and you wouldn't have the database schema in your editor with the Django model, because that's just not the way it works.
Right.
So, okay. So it sounds like sort of an incomplete, test with GitHub Copilot. Right. Maybe there's a need for a little more learning to use the tool, because it is a more tailored tool.
Right.
So we've got, so if these were three of your eager intern students, Steve, sounds like GitHub Copilot gets an incomplete. How do you
Right.
how do you grade Claude and how do you grade ChatGPT 4?
Through this, and I've done a couple smaller scale experiments since, but again, I would consider them in high complexity in overall time it would take a human being to do. So far, Claude has outpaced ChatGPT in giving me accurate code and providing more options for me than ChatGPT does. So for me right now, I'd keep Claude on the team. Yeah, I'd probably get rid of Copilot after a couple days. I'm like, sorry, it's not working out, man. ChatGPT, might be getting coffee for me. Wouldn't necessarily let her go, but give her kind of the grunt work. So yeah, Claude right now, so far, is my tool of choice.
So still, as they say, a developing situation.
Right.
See what
always,
I did?
right.
See what I did there? Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, it's still early days with these technologies, right, Steve?
Right.
The evolution we've seen in the last year in these tools is really amazing, right?
Yes.
So your takeaway from all of this, we sort of teased this at the top of the podcast, but so your takeaway for all of this relative to, okay, what should we do and be teaching our students?
My takeaway, whether you are a software developer or not, sorry, so this just applies to everybody. Learn how to write good prompts. Because it is akin, and you said this, it's akin to becoming an expert searcher of Google, which the vast majority of people who come to Nashville Software School have no idea how to use Google. They're absolutely atrocious at it. And we coach them on how to, no, this is how you're going to ask Google, right? This is how you're going to evaluate the first articles to see if your keywords were right. And if they weren't, go back and update your keywords, right? That's something we've been teaching people for years and years and years. It's the same thing now, right? Starting on week 1, I basically do behavior modeling, right? So when I'm asking these tools for things, when I'm in front of them, right, we're building something collaboratively. I say, well, I don't know how to do this thing, right? I'm going to go to ChatGPT and I would show them exactly how I would prompt it just through the techniques that I've learned so far, so they can pick up on the same techniques and try to utilize them to get, again, higher value out of it. And I think that applies to anybody who wants to use these tools, is understanding how important context is, how important specificity is, right? But again, in the realm of context, for example, we tell students, no matter what you prompt this tool for, your first sentence should be, I am a beginner JavaScript developer. No matter what you want from it, that should always be right. So you're being specific and you're giving it the context that it needs to change its output that is appropriate to what you said you are. And it is oddly good at that. I mean, I'm just blown away how good it is of picking up on just that sentence and radically changing its response to a student versus me asking the same question and not saying I'm a beginner. I'll get a vastly different, more complex, more expert level response. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe to the $1 million question, certainly the one that we've probably discussed and argued about the most over the last year is, so what about students using these tools to generate code that they include in assignments, that they include in their assessment exercises, that they include in their capstones, which are all these pieces that we're assessing to assess whether our students are learning to be professional software engineers.
Right. This is the early days, right? And we're going to obviously adjust as we go, but you've seen this, and anybody who's been on top of this news, we've seen that more and more developers are starting to say, yeah, I'm integrating this daily into my workflow. It's quickly becoming the tool of choice to accelerate your productivity. So what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of cohorts is, for the vast majority of the cohort, is coaching them on good prompt design in terms of helping them understand pre-written code or their own code that they wrote it incorrectly, and help them fix it. Be a tutor, right? Those daily challenges. Here's some code I don't understand. Help me with my vocabulary. For the vast majority of the cohort, that's what I'm going to be doing with them. Now what I'm going to try is the final 6 weeks, right? So they're about to graduate. They've pretty much done the bulk of the material in the course. And me and Val Freeman and Josh are already starting to talk about, what does this structure look like? We're going to do specific workshops with them on how to do prompt design, good prompt design, to generate higher quality code, and show them how to provide the context needed to get good code output. Because I think that is the key skill that I've learned. Is it has nothing to do with the problem itself. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand. It has really nothing to do with the problem you're trying to solve. It all has to do with the context that you're providing the tools. That is the main driver of what you're going to get back. So we're going to try that over the next couple of cohorts, and it's going to be very structured in that we would like you to use these tools for this project, or maybe even your capstone. And we want you to tell us what code do you use from these tools, and then what you did to understand it. And we will review all of that code with them, and we will review their process for how they came up with their prompt.
So if I'm understanding what you've said, Steve, up until the last 6 weeks, and then we're talking about a full-time 6-month program here, right? So, so these students are with us Monday through Friday, 9 to 4, for 6 months. So up until the last 6 weeks, they're going to be learning basically prompt engineering as a skill, just like we taught them strong Google foo, right? Good searching skills. But they're still going to be responsible for writing the final code that gets submitted.
Right.
Right. Because they have to develop the skills to understand and know how to test, because whether they're working with code they wrote or somebody else wrote, or that a tool generated, they've still got to test it. They've still got to be able to map back from the code to the requirements, to the problem, and say, does this solve the problem, right? So they're still going to be learning how to do that, but learning prompt engineering is a tool to help them learn and to help them, master these programming skills probably faster.
Right.
But we're still going to be assessing their knowledge of the code that gets submitted to ensure that they wrote it. They're able to explain it. They understand how to test it.
Right.
But that in the last 6 weeks, we'll be sharpening up the prompt engineering, or targeting the prompt engineering. Maybe that's a better word, a little more, so that they can even start to generate code, right? So they will be doing the mapping from the problem to figure out how to prompt, how to provide context, right? So they'll be translating basically from the problem to the requirement statement that you're given the tool, but that there may well be a project there in those last 6 weeks where they're actually able to use the generated code once they have validated and verified it, and are able to demonstrate that skill to the instructors. Am I understanding that?
They will be evaluated on 2 separate skills. They're still going to be evaluated on their ability to explain and understand the code they are presenting to us. We are also going to evaluate them on their prompt design skills.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So interesting step forward. We'll see how that goes over the next cohort or two.
Yep.
And this is still, again, this is early days. It's still very much in an evolutionary stage of these tools, and in understanding how it is going to amplify the productivity of professional developers, right? I know that there was some interesting stats. I believe these are GitHub stats, if I remember right, talking about how, the amount of productivity enhancement that developers got from using, I believe, was GitHub Copilot, and how it was the most junior people that got the biggest percentage productivity enhancement. In other words, it allowed junior developers to rise to the productivity level of an intermediate developer relatively quickly. So that'll be an interesting thing for us to track here over the next couple of cohorts and see how this goes. So, but so we've kind of evolved in the last little over a year, I guess, from don't you dare put any code generated by a generative AI tool into a final solution to let's learn how to use these tools effectively, just like we've always been teaching them how to use debuggers and their code editor and the search tools and the other resources that are available to us as professional problem solvers, which is really what our students are graduating to be.
That's right.
The problems are still there to be solved. We're just getting much more powerful tools to solve them with.
Yep.
Is kind of my takeaway on this.
That's right.
And I still believe what this is going to do is open up more problems to be solved, or more old problems that we've solved one way that we can now solve even more effectively by embedding generative AI tools into the delivered solution. But I think that's another talk for another day, Steve. So
absolutely.
All right. So any last thoughts from you before we wrap this up?
I'm just going to wrap this up and say I believe that this is an evolutionary step forward in how software development is done. But again, we've just barely scratched the tip of the paint, and things that I'm trying, and I know some things that other people are trying to really explore the depths of what these tools are capable of doing, I think is probably going to be one of the next big steps. And we're going to see more content about that over the next year.
All right. Yeah. And the only other thing I want to wrap around this is we haven't addressed a lot of the other issues associated with taking code from one of these tools and putting it in an application. The state of the legal and regulatory and ethical environment around generative AI is very unsettled. And, there are lawsuits out there, for example, about these tools being trained on other people on copyrighted or licensed, even if it's open source license requiring attribution, for code or for documents or for whatever. And so we're a long way from having all the answers to how we're going to be able to use generative AI. And that has resulted in a lot of employers not allowing the use of these tools in a production environment to generate the code that gets released into a production environment. So again, we want to caution everybody, understand your context in which you're using the tools, because not every employer will let you use them today. But even those employers, I believe, soon are going to need developers who understand how to leverage generative AI technology. So, but it's still early days, and we're actually at NSS, we're working with a very large employer here in Nashville on a internal class that we've started delivering called Generative AI for Leaders, which is a 6-hour, much deeper dive for executives and senior managers over what these tools are capable of in solving business problems, application problems, how we're going to embed them into applications, but also all these legal and ethical and data issues associated with them. So I suspect there'll be more news about that one of these days too, Absolutely. Jessica. So might want to interview somebody about that one, Jessica. Anyways, and Steve, thanks for doing the deep dive on this, and sort of picking up on some of those BSing over a cup of coffee thoughts and turning it into, a really interesting exercise, how different generative AI tools are just like different programmers. They're going to give you a different answer and totally believe that their answer is the right one. So,
Yep.
All right.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening. You can find the links mentioned in today's podcast in the show notes below. Hear more insights like these when you visit NashvilleSoftwareSchool.com.